Think of your brain as a office space with lots of filing cabinets. And when you experience something, it turns into memory. That memory is essentially a manila folder that gets placed somewhere in a filing cabinet that most of the time makes sense. And you're able to access that information at another time. When you think about trauma, though, it doesn't operate the same way. The normal systems that are involved in memory creation are hijacked by your fight, flight, freeze response. Shame, stress, life threatening situations will cause your brain to operate in a completely different way, which I like to view as a red manila folder. Red manila folders don't fit in our filing cabinets for a number of reasons. With traumatic memories, our alarm systems actually go off. And most of the time, when we're talking about a traumatic trigger or being triggered for a trauma or trauma response, what we're actually communicating about is that our brains are struggling to recognize that there is a difference between the current moment that we're in and the experience of that memory. One other way that these alarm systems goes off is with negative cognition. So these are beliefs that we have about ourselves from a traumatic memory. Let's say that I get beaten up in front of King Soopers, and that afterwards I feel like I should have been able to defend myself and that there's something wrong with me that I wasn't. A lot of the times we want to work towards clearly identifying what that negative cognition is, because it's helpful for us to be able to essentially process through that negative belief and replace it with a positive cognition. So something that starts off as I am weak and unable to protect myself might become something like I am strong enough to have made it through this experience, or I am strong enough to fight back. So as we think about our brains as this office space with lots of filing cabinets and places for storage, one of the things that I like to picture is having a desk in front of us, that I'm the captain of my brain, and at my desk is where I do a lot of my work. It would be way more busy than it is right now. Whenever I'm in a conversation with, say, Sandra, and she brings up a sandwich, I might have a folder that is for sandwiches. I'm able to have my brain access that memory from the filing cabinets. I open it up because I want to go through what I know about sandwiches. And within it are documents, paperwork that helps me to be able to identify, oh, sandwiches typically have bread. Sometimes they have meat, but sometimes they don't. I'm able to access all of this, and my brain has been able to process through the information and to make it easily accessible for me to be able to search through my understanding of sandwiches. With traumatic memories, though, when they show up, it comes across and it opens on its own. We don't really have the option. And what's inside of it is not information. What's inside of it is more like objects. They're things that our brains can't nicely fold up and just put into our filing cabinets. This could be a number of things. It could be the scissors that were used to cause harm at some point, right? And what is interesting is that whereas in the blue folder, I might have the experience of, ooh, I can remember the taste of the last ham and cheese sandwich that I had. When it comes to traumatic memory, it's less like I'm remembering and more like I'm experiencing in the present moment. So how exactly does a manila folder become red? How does trauma happen? So there are so many different ways. It's important for us to be able to recognize that not all traumatic experiences cause trauma, and not all trauma is caused by traumatic experiences. There's a really excellent book by a man named Dr. Van der Kolk. It's called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's one of the best books for normalizing a lot of our experiences with trauma. In the book, he talks about how sometimes our brains are kind of a dumb organ and don't know the difference between compounding distress, shame, or life-threatening instances that we would normally call like a traumatic experience. In the process of a traumatic experience or that shame experience, there's a lot of brain stuff that goes on. I'm not going to dive into it too much. There's a lot of great research on what happens, but essentially what happens is that our brains go into fight, flight, freeze. And when we're in that place, our normal process of memory and retaining information isn't happening. We're trying to protect ourselves from something. You can think of this as putting your hand on a stovetop. We don't want our brains to have to go through the normal process of experience where we think, oh, this feels warm, maybe it feels hot. What is the risk involved here? Should I take my hand off of this, or can I leave it on here? By that point, we're injured. We want our brains to have some of these autonomic responses to threats. The problem is that sometimes those become really sticky and they are stuck in processing. Sometimes a traumatic experience does process normally, and we're able to operate in such a way where we recognize that it's a memory. It comes across our desk and the alarm signals don't go off. We don't think that we're in the memory. Other times, though, it gets stuck at the site of reception, which is essentially communicating that there are different senses that we experience the world through, and sometimes that traumatic experience gets stuck in one of those senses. We might smell burning rubber and feel like we just got into the car accident again. It's really important to note too, just from a normalizing and validating perspective, that when we're experiencing a traumatic response, when that red manila folder shows up at our desk, that it's not just a memory of what we had for lunch yesterday. It is almost as if we are experiencing the memory physically, like we did when it happened. A metaphor that I like to use with this situation is, imagine you and I are walking in the forest and we hear a twig snap, and then we're suddenly mauled by a mountain lion. A year or two later, we show up at my office and we hear what sounds like a twig snapping again. For someone who has not had the experience that we had, they might hear the twig snap and feel like that's odd. It doesn't belong in an office space. For you and I, more than likely, what's going to happen is that we hear the twig snap and it triggers this defensive, protective response from us that says to us, there is a mountain lion who is about to maul us. And so we might fall into fight, flight, freeze, where we're trying to figure out how to keep ourselves safe from the real threat that we are perceiving from the environment. So then the question is, how do you fix this? How do you get a red manila folder to turn into a normal manila folder? How do you make it so that you can hear a twig snapping and not think that a mountain lion's coming to get you? How do you change the negative cognition to a positive cognition? There are a lot of different ways to approach this, and I will likely make a video on one or two of them on how we process through trauma. The important thing for us to be able to recognize is that almost every single one of the evidence-based approaches for processing through trauma is just that. It's processing through it. And so one of the things that we're trying to do when we process through trauma is to take these items and to start assimilating them into information, putting that in there, and the scissors might stay for a little bit. As we become less sensitive to these triggering signals, we can start to remove the scissors from the folder. And it's at that point when this memory really does become a normal memory, we're able to hand it off to long-term storage. And at any time, I'm able to access of my own will this memory and to remember, oh yes, those scissors, they caused this trauma, or they were involved in this traumatic experience. But it is very much me going in and going through what I know about those scissors, rather than it showing up in this autonomic response that I have very little volition over. Whether that's through internal family systems or eye movement desensitization reprocessing, even exposure therapy, what we're trying to communicate to our brains is, hey, we're not in this moment anymore. We can actually let this one go and to allow it to be a normal memory that we pull back. Now, with normal memory, we're not saying that we're getting rid of the red folder entirely. We're actually just moving the content of it to another folder where our brains are able to receive it like a normal memory. You're not going to lose that memory. And in fact, I think it would actually be really harmful for us if we could, as much as we want to at times. What this looks like in practicality is that you and I sit in our office, we hear a twig snap, and we may or may not have the thought of a mountain lion come up. And if we do have the thought of a mountain lion coming up, I'm still able to be centered. I'm able to feel okay. I'm able to feel safe in that room while thinking about the event that caused the original trauma. We might joke to each other of like, uh-oh, here comes the mountain lion. And it doesn't trigger anything in us. We don't start freaking out. We don't start feeling frightened. We're actually able to reference back to it. It might be something where we pull up that memory and we realize something that we didn't realize before. It is also a goal to be able to change that negative cognition to a positive cognition, where you and I, in the pre-processed trauma of the mountain lion experience, might think, I am living in a very dangerous world that's out to kill me, which is scary enough to believe, especially if that memory can come up unbidden and we don't feel like we have any control over it. Once we process through the memory and we're able to replace that negative cognition with something positive, such as I'm a survivor and I'm able to handle most things, all of a sudden that twig snapping sound shows up in our office. And rather thinking about the danger, we're thinking about our own ability to be able to handle danger. And it becomes this encouraging or bolstering. It sounds a little bit too nice for most people who are in the midst of a traumatic experience, but it does come out the other side where, rather than essentially putting on this negative belief that I am in danger always and unable to fight back, it allows me to pull up that memory willfully, to open it willfully, and to feel like I am capable of handling whatever comes through that door. Hope this has been helpful for you. Feel free to leave a comment, leave a like, would be great. And I will see you in the next one.